Welcome aboard Rocket Ship, the platform with the most relevant content for competitive examinations. This is Rocket Ship IAS Lab and continuing with our series on answer writing for general studies papers of civil service main examination. We take up a question that you might come across in GS paper 1. Please read out the question carefully. During the medieval period, Bhakti movement was not merely a reaction to superstitions and religious dogma. Rather, it was a potent social force in its own right. Critically analyze. As you can see, this question is the typical open-ended kind of questions. That is, the question talks about Bhakti movement being a potent social force, but it does not explain what the question means by calling Bhakti movement a potent social force. That is, you have to give your own interpretation of the idea of Bhakti movement being a social potent social force, and then you have to critically analyze the whole you could say argument, the whole assumption. As usual, we are introducing our answer with going into the historical background of the Bhakti movement. That is, the core doctrines of Bhakti Marg can be traced back to the devotional phase of Tamil poetry, which by most, you could say, observers, by most scholars, started around the 5th century CE. Nayanars, who were devoted to Shiva, and Alvars, who were devoted to Vishnu, composed prabandhas or verses to expound the essential doctrines of bhakti. So, actually, what we call the Bhakti Marg nowadays can be traced back to the spiritual tradition of Tamil Nadu, going back to the 5th century CE, 5th century Common Era, where the Nayanar saints who were devotees of Shiva, and Alvaras who were devotees of Lord Vishnu, they you could say they expounded the essential doctrines of Bhakti movement. Bhakti's focus on total abandon and surrender to one's aradhya, that is the deity who is object of one's devotion, meant a more personal. These are very important points, please highlight these points. This meant this total surrender to one's aradhya or object of devotion meant a more personal spiritual journey that did not require a priest as intermediary. Again, the point is, unlike the Vedic ritualism, for example, you commission a yajna where you always needed a priest. Bhakti had a more intimate, more one-to-one relation with your aradhya, with the deity. You had a more personal one-to-one relation. Bhakti was also simpler compared to the complex rituals of the Vedas. Moreover, compared to the arcane, that is mysterious, compared to the arcane abstract Upanishadic philosophy, Bhakti was more appealing to the common masses, for whom it was easier to understand compared to the you could say abstract and mysterious Upanishadic philosophy that was quite complex. But it grew into a major social force beyond countering superstition and dogmatism. That is, it did not only lead to, you could say, simplification of ritualism, but rather it became a social force in its own regard, in its own right. How we can say that? We can say this through its, you could say, its impact on various aspects of the society. For example, it countered social divisions based on caste and varn system. Then it gave respectful place for females, which is again, which for an example, female deities and saints, which acquired respectful place under the Bhakti mark. It also helped to some extent to reconcile differences, communal differences among different religions like Hinduism and Islam. Then it's very important point that is often ignored, that it legitimized vernacular and folk practices And we are not only meaning, we are not saying that it just meant legitimizing the vernacular language, but it also, you could say, expanded the ambit of spiritual corpus to include the ones composed in local language art forms, which were essentially folk art forms. They were brought within the, you could say, entire corpus of bhakti practices. It assimilated folk deities and mythology, as we would see through examples later. Moreover, you can understand its continued importance, its continued potency, because it has acted as a cultural ambassador of India. It has a role, continued role as a cultural ambassador of India, which you can understand through the example of modern day Bhagavatism, Krishnaism, etc., which have spread beyond the shores of India. Elaborating on these points, Bhakti Marg countered the rigid distinctions of caste and Varna system, emphasizing on devotion rather than the pretensions of high birth. It emphasized, actually, we would repeat it, Bhakti Marg emphasized on devotion over pretensions of high birth. Rather than high birth, it talked about, you could say, high ideals and high, you could say, good conduct. Bhakti attempted forging an alternative community of believers where you were not, you could say, associated with each other through, you could say, caste and creed, but rather through a common object of worship. The common aradhya was common to the entire, you could say, community of bhakts. Nowhere it is more evident than in the hagiography, that is, biography of saints, hagiography of Bhakti saints, a great many of whom, like Bhakt Namdev, Bhakt Tukaram, Bhakt Raidas, Bhakt Kabir Das, etc., all of them came from lower strata of the Varna hierarchy. So we can say, to some extent, the Bhakti tradition attempted to, or like even was successful to, mellow down the rigidities of the caste and Varna system. Equally notable is Bhakti's role in creating a common ground for Hindu and Muslim spiritualism. You can mention, if space and time permits, Bhakti's influence on Sufism, and in fact the reciprocal, you could say, arrangement, that is Sufism impact on Bhakti. Muslim origin saints like Raskhan Maharaj Ji, Abdul Rahim Khane Khana, etc., are counted amongst the foremost of Bhakti saints. So we can say that, we can actually see here that the Bhakti movement, the Bhakti tradition, actually, you could say, it was a more, you could say, syncretic tradition, which adopted elements from Islamist spiritualism as well, and moreover, it also gave prominent place to Muslim origin saints. Then possibly for the first time since Upanishadic period, again this is a very very important point, pay attention here, pay special attention here. Possibly for the first time since Upanishadic period, where we have the example of Brahmavadinis like Maitreyi, Apala, Gargi, etc. We would repeat it, Brahmavadinis were spiritual scholars like Maitreyi, Apala, Gargi, etc. And Tantrism, Vajrayan, Tantrism tradition in Hinduism and Vajrayan tradition among the Buddhists. After these two periods, Bhakti was probably the first time that it accorded a deservedly respectable place to the female. Deities like Radha and Andala were treated as essence of Bhakti. Female saints like Mahadevi Akka Mahadevi, who comes from Veer Shaiva or Lingayat. She comes from Lingayat, you could say, tradition. Mirabai, who is well known in North India at least, and Muktatai, who was the sister of Sant Gyaneshwar or Dhyaneshwar of Maharashtra. So all of them, that is saints like Mahadevi Akka, Mirabai, Muktatai, etc., attained places second to none. That is, they were accorded places which were, you could say, quite equivalent to their male counterparts. Moreover, many people who are actually devotees of Krishna, they would actually confess that Radha is considered the essence of the Lord's entire Maya, the Lord's entire creation. So Radha is given such a prominent place, that is, she is considered the his very Shakti. She is considered the very essence of the Lord's creation. Bhakti's role in legitimizing vernacular language is well known. We are not going into details of that. You can cite examples of Goswami Tulsidas, or for that matter, Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, etc., who actually were successful in legitimizing the bhakti or spiritual literature in the vernacular language. But it did not stop at that. Art forms like Ram Leela, Ras Leela, etc. acquired respectability only through their association with bhakti. Folk practices and local deities were included in the bhakti pantheon. That is the, you could say, entire group of bhakti deities, bhakti gods. For an example, Khandoba, who is considered the guardian god or guardian deity of pastoralists like shepherds, cowherds, etc., was assimilated into bhakti. Khandoba is actually Khandoba is a folk god from Maharashtra, modern day Maharashtra, and he is well accepted as part of the bhakti, you could say, pantheon. Moreover, bhakti is intimate spirituality, that is one to one spiritual relation with one's aradhya. Its disavowal of caste, varn, creed, and racial differences give it an appeal far and wide. That is, it has an appeal even beyond India's source. This is perhaps why it is India's most successful spiritual export after yoga. Again, you can differ with me here, but in my opinion, bhakti is India's second most important spiritual export, just after yoga, or maybe even equivalent, or even you could say more prominent than yoga. The modern day popularity of Krishnaism vouches for its role as India's cultural ambassador. That is the role of Bhakti movement as India's cultural ambassador. And the most prominent sect among Krishnaism is the society called ISKCON. And we know very well how popular ISKCON has become, or like modern day Bhagavatism or Krishna worship has become across the world. To briefly sum up, Bhakti helped mellow down rigidities of caste, creed, and gender. It assimilated vernacular practices and has continued appeal as the cultural ambassador of India. So these were the points where we are actually talking of the success of Bhakti movement. However, the question itself talks about critically analyzing its Bhakti's stature as a potent social force. So, for briefly, you can talk about the areas where Bhakti indeed came short. That is, Bhakti had, you could say, a very good attention. The entire Bhakti tradition had very good attention, but it was not entirely able to eradicate the caste or creed rigidities. It was not, to be very frank, quite able to bring reconciliation, complete reconciliation between Hindus and Muslims. So these are some of the areas where Bhakti indeed came short. So for the sake of the question framed as critically analyzing a statement, you can mention these shortcomings, or rather the points where Bhakti came short. This was all for today. That is where we have talked about the Bhakti movement being a potent social force, and it was our interpretation in how many ways it has served as a potent social force. Before we call it a day, as usual, we would assure you that we are going to assemble for a new lecture in a few days. As usual, we wish you all the best. Thank you.